Good morning. Today, December 2025. Before I proceed with today's analysis, let me remind you to hit that like button if you find value in what we're discussing here. Now, we find ourselves at what I can only describe as a pivotal moment in the ongoing economic war between the West and Russia. What we're witnessing is nothing short of a complete inversion of intended outcomes. Over the past 72 hours, we've witnessed a cascade of developments that fundamentally challenge everything we've been told about the effectiveness of Western sanctions. The narrative is cracking, and the reality beneath is far more complex and frankly more embarrassing for Western policymakers than they care to admit. Let me put this starkly. The biggest sanctions offensive in modern history is not just failing, it's actively strengthening the very partnerships it was designed to destroy. But we'll come to why this matters for global order in a moment. To understand what's happening now, we must first examine how we arrived at this extraordinary moment. The Western sanctions regime against Russia, initially conceived as a swift economic decapitation strike, has now entered its fourth year. The architects of this policy, primarily officials in Washington and Brussels, believed they could weaponize the global financial system to bring Moscow to its knees. This confidence was not entirely misplaced. After all, the dollar-dominated international order had served Western interests remarkably well since Bretton Woods. Countries that defied Washington's preferences found themselves cut off from SWIFT, unable to access international markets, their economies suffocated by financial isolation. But here's what the sanctions architects fundamentally miscalculated. They assumed the world of 2022 was still the world of now. They failed to grasp that 3 decades of economic development had created alternative power centers, alternative financial systems, and most crucially, alternative relationships that could function entirely outside Western control. The hubris here is remarkable when you consider the historical record. Previous sanctions regimes against Iran, North Korea, and Iraq succeeded primarily because the targeted countries lacked viable economic alternatives. But Russia in 2022 was fundamentally different. It possessed vast natural resources, maintained technological capabilities across multiple sectors, and had spent 8 years since 2014 systematically preparing for exactly this scenario. The recent Putin-Modi summit in New Delhi provides a perfect illustration of this miscalculation. But before we examine that in detail, let me walk you through the latest developments that have exposed just how dramatically this economic war strategy is backfiring. On October 22nd, President Trump imposed what were described as the most comprehensive sanctions yet on Russia's oil sector, targeting Rosneft and Lukoil companies that together account for roughly half of Russia's oil production. The announcement was accompanied by the usual triumphant rhetoric about choking off Putin's war machine. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Initial reports suggested these sanctions were having their intended effect. Chinese and Indian refiners temporarily paused their Russian crude purchases. Oil tankers sat idle in ports. Western media breathlessly reported on Russia's isolation from global energy markets. But pay attention to what happened next, because this is where the sanctions regime's fundamental weakness becomes apparent. Within weeks, Russian oil exports had not only recovered, but were flowing through increasingly sophisticated networks designed to circumvent Western restrictions entirely. According to the latest data from Kepler, a commodity analytics firm, Russian crude exports are being redirected through what they diplomatically call non-sanctioned intermediaries, companies with names like Tatneft, Rus export and more export have suddenly appeared as major players in global oil trading. These aren't new entities, they're essentially rebranded versions of existing Russian operations, structured specifically to navigate around sanctions. The result, Russia is still selling its oil, but now at even deeper discounts that make it more attractive to buyers, while the complexity of these new arrangements actually increases Moscow's leverage over its customers. The sanctions haven't eliminated Russian oil from global markets. They've simply made the entire system more opaque and less stable. What's particularly fascinating about these new trading networks is their sophistication. Russian tankers now routinely engage in ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, switching flags multiple times during single voyages. The Shadow Fleet has expanded to over 400 ships, many flying flags of convenience, from countries with limited maritime oversight. Insurance and financing increasingly comes from non-Western sources, with Chinese and Russian banks developing specialized instruments to facilitate energy trade outside the SWIFT system. But the real drama is unfolding in Brussels, where the European Union's attempt to weaponize frozen Russian assets has descended into farce. The plan, championed by European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, seemed elegant in its simplicity. Use $40 billion in frozen Russian central bank assets as collateral for loans to Ukraine. The proposal required unanimous EU support, and initially it appeared to have it. Germany, France, and most other major economies lined up behind the scheme. It was presented as both financially prudent and morally justified, making Russia pay for its own defeat, as one official put it. Then Belgium threw a wrench into the entire machinery. Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever announced his country's opposition to the plan, citing what he called fundamental legal and financial risks. But here's what makes Belgium's position so devastating. Most of the frozen Russian assets, approximately $103 billion, are held at Euroclear, a financial clearinghouse based in Brussels. Without Belgian cooperation, the entire scheme collapses, and Belgium isn't budging. The European Central Bank has now formally refused to provide guarantees for the loan, stating that such an arrangement would violate EU treaty law and compromise the institution's independence. The implications extend far beyond this specific proposal. What we're witnessing is the exposure of a fundamental contradiction in the EU's approach to economic warfare. The very legal frameworks and institutional safeguards that give European financial systems their credibility are now blocking the political objectives of European leaders. This isn't just a bureaucratic hiccup. It's a constitutional crisis disguised as a technical dispute. The ECB's refusal to participate essentially declares that the Commission's plan amounts to illegal state financing. Belgium's position makes clear that even EU member states have serious doubts about the legality of confiscating sovereign assets. The irony here is profound. The EU has spent decades building legal frameworks designed to prevent exactly this kind of arbitrary asset seizure. The rule of law, property rights, and institutional independence were supposed to be the foundations that distinguished European governance from more authoritarian alternatives. Now, European leaders find themselves arguing that these same principles should be suspended in service of geopolitical objectives. Belgium's resistance isn't just about financial liability, it's about preserving the integrity of the legal system that underpins European economic credibility. International investors are asking precisely these questions. The legal precedent being established here could fundamentally alter how sovereign wealth funds and central banks view European markets. Against this backdrop of Western disarray, the Putin-Modi summit in New Delhi this week provided a masterclass in how to navigate competing pressures while maintaining strategic autonomy. The symbolism alone was striking. India rolled out the red carpet for Putin with a full ceremonial welcome, complete with honor guards and a 21-gun salute, just days after Trump had imposed punitive 50% tariffs on Indian goods, specifically because of New Delhi's continued purchases of Russian oil. To pay attention to the substance beneath the symbolism, because this reveals something crucial about how the international system is actually evolving. Putin's promise of uninterrupted oil supplies to India wasn't just a commercial commitment, it was a direct challenge to the sanctions regime's underlying premise. Modi's response was equally significant. Rather than offering vague diplomatic language, he explicitly described energy security as a strong and important pillar of India-Russia relations, while announcing plans for expanded cooperation in nuclear energy, shipbuilding, and critical minerals. The two leaders signed agreements spanning everything from labor mobility to fertilizer production. Most tellingly, they unveiled an India-Russia Vision 2030 document aimed at boosting bilateral trade to $100 billion annually. This isn't just an aspiration, it's a concrete plan to create economic relationships that function entirely outside Western financial systems. India's position exposes the fundamental weakness in America's approach to economic coalition. Washington has attempted to pressure New Delhi by imposing tariffs, but this strategy assumes India has no alternatives. The Putin-Modi summit demonstrated precisely the opposite. India has multiple options, and American pressure is actually accelerating New Delhi's diversification away from Western dependence. What makes this particularly significant is that India isn't an outlier. It's representative of a broader global South response to Western economic warfare. Countries that were once reluctant to openly defy Western pressure are now calculating that the risks of compliance may outweigh the costs of resistance. Consider Turkey's position. Despite being a NATO member, Ankara continues to serve as a major hub for Russian energy exports. Turkish refineries are processing Russian crude and selling the refined products globally, including to European markets. When pressed by Washington to reduce these flows, Turkish officials have essentially responded with a shrug. Similarly, China's approach to sanctions compliance has been selectively creative. While major state-owned enterprises like Sinopec and PetroChina have reduced direct purchases of Russian oil, private Chinese companies have dramatically increased their involvement in the Russian energy trade. The net effect is that China's total imports of Russian energy have remained stable, while the country has gained valuable leverage over both Moscow and Washington. Beijing's strategy here demonstrates how sophisticated economies can navigate sanctions regimes without directly confronting them. Chinese refineries have developed complex supply chains that technically comply with sanctions while achieving the same practical outcomes. China has used the sanctions crisis to accelerate development of alternative payment systems and commodity exchanges that operate independently of Western oversight. The yuan-denominated oil futures market in Shanghai has seen dramatic growth, providing a viable alternative to dollar-based pricing. The pattern is clear. Sanctions work when the target has no alternatives. They fail when alternatives exist, and the political will to pursue them is strong. The current situation demonstrates that both conditions now favor sanctions evasion rather than compliance. Now let me address what this means for the various power centers involved, because the implications extend far beyond energy markets. For the United States, the failure of the sanctions strategy represents a fundamental challenge to dollar hegemony. The entire post-Bretton Woods system depends on the assumption that countries cannot afford to be excluded from dollar-denominated trade. But when major economies like India and China demonstrate they can maintain robust economic relationships outside this system, the dollar's role as the ultimate enforcer of American preferences comes into question. This is why the Treasury Department's reaction to recent developments has been so telling. Rather than doubling down on enforcement, officials have begun floating the possibility of sanctions relief in exchange for diplomatic concessions. The shift from maximum pressure to pressure for negotiations signals an implicit acknowledgement that the current approach isn't achieving its objectives. For the European Union, the situation is even more precarious. The frozen assets debacle has exposed the extent to which European leaders allowed political ambitions to override legal and financial prudence. The ECB's refusal to participate in what it clearly views as an illegal scheme has created an institutional crisis that extends far beyond the specific question of Russian assets. Moreover, the EU's energy security remains fundamentally compromised. Despite years of sanctions and repeated commitments to eliminate Russian energy imports, significant flows continue through complex intermediary arrangements. European consumers are paying higher prices for energy that often originates in Russia, but arrives through third countries at marked up rates. For Russia, the current situation validates the strategy of economic diversification that Moscow has pursued since 20. The initial shock of sanctions forced Russian policymakers to develop alternative financial mechanisms, expand trade relationships with non-Western countries, and invest heavily in domestic production capabilities. These investments are now paying dividends. Russian oil revenues, while lower than pre-sanctions levels, have stabilized at levels sufficient to maintain both domestic economic stability and military operations. More importantly, Russia has demonstrated that a major economy can function effectively outside Western financial systems, providing a template for other countries considering similar strategies. The corruption scandals now emerging in Ukraine add another layer of complexity. The resignation of Andriy Yermak, head of Zelensky's office, over allegations of embezzlement comes at precisely the moment when Western financial support is becoming increasingly difficult to secure. These scandals matter because they undermine the narrative that has been crucial to maintaining Western public support. The timing is particularly unfortunate for Kyiv, with the EU's frozen assets scheme collapsing just as winter energy demands peak. Recent Russian strikes on Ukrainian power infrastructure have demonstrated Moscow's continued ability to inflict significant damage on the country's energy grid. Reports suggest that these strikes have been more effective than previous campaigns, with some Ukrainian officials privately acknowledging that full restoration of the electrical system may not be possible before spring. The combination of infrastructure damage, funding shortfalls, and corruption scandals creates a perfect storm of challenges for Ukrainian leadership. Looking ahead, several trends seem likely to accelerate. First, the development of alternative financial systems will continue to gain momentum. The success of Russia, India, and China in maintaining robust trade relationships, despite Western sanctions, demonstrates that dollar-based restrictions are not insurmountable obstacles. Second, energy markets will become increasingly regionalized and politicized. The era of truly global commodity markets may be ending, replaced by competing blocks with different pricing mechanisms, quality standards, and political alignments. Third, the legal and institutional frameworks that support international economic cooperation will come under increasing strain. The EU's frozen assets crisis is just one example of how political objectives can conflict with legal obligations and institutional integrity. Fourth, developing countries will likely accelerate their efforts to reduce dependence on Western financial systems and institutions. The weaponization of sanctions has made clear that access to these systems comes with significant political strings attached. The fundamental question now is whether Western policymakers will acknowledge these realities and adjust their strategies accordingly, or whether they will continue to pursue policies that are demonstrably counterproductive. The evidence suggests that ideological commitment to economic warfare may override practical considerations of effectiveness. What makes this particularly concerning is the apparent disconnect between public statements and private assessments within Western governments. Intelligence reports increasingly acknowledge the limited effectiveness of current sanctions, yet political leaders continue to advocate for escalation rather than recalibration. This disconnect reflects a broader problem in contemporary Western policymaking, the substitution of wishful thinking for strategic analysis. When policies fail to achieve their stated objectives, the response is often to assume more of the same approach will eventually succeed, rather than to question fundamental assumptions. If this analysis is correct, we should expect continued fragmentation of the global economic system with profound implications for trade, investment, and political relationships. The post-Cold War era of Western-dominated globalization may be drawing to a close, replaced by a more complex, multipolar system with competing centers of economic and political power. The question for Western leaders is whether they will adapt to this new reality or continue fighting to preserve a system that may already be beyond recovery. The sanctions boomerang effect we're witnessing today may well be remembered as the moment when the unipolar world order began its terminal decline. Whether what emerges in its place will be more stable and prosperous remains to be seen, but change now appears inevitable. This is where I'll conclude today's analysis. You can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Don't forget to check out our Substack page for additional content. And of course, please remember to hit that like button and verify your subscription to this channel. More analysis coming soon. Have a very good day.